morning from HoopSisters. We're here to show you block A3, which is one of our flying geese blocks. I'm not finished with my sample yet. I still have to add the border on it, but this is our block A3, and I'm going to show you how to do one of the flying geese blocks. They're all basically done the same way, so there'll be one video that will cover all the flying geese blocks, so you can review this at any time. Why don't you come with me to the cutting table and I'll show you what you need to get started. Okay, what you'll need first of all is the instructions that your dealer should have supplied for you. And you will see here I've already placed my swatches of the fabric that I'll be using on here. We will be needing, for the background fabric, we will be needing a 9-inch square for the 8-inch size. And if you're doing the 5-inch blocks, you're going to be needing a 6-inch square. You will also be needing the backing fabric. I'm doing the 8-inch square, so I have 9-inch squares of fabric here, and this is my backing fabric. And if you're doing the 5-inch, you'll be needing a 6-inch square. And then here I have my geese fabric. My goose is going to be blue, so I have a 4.5-inch strip that was cut the width of the fabric. And again, that's for the 8-inch. And let me do a peek here. I need to cheat and see 3-inch strip if you're doing the 5-inch blocks. And then on fabric 3, which is my sky, it's going to be a 3.5-inch strip for the 8-inch blocks and a 2.5-inch strip if you're doing a 5-inch block. Other things you'll need would be you'll need to choose your thread. So I have my thread here. I've got it all numbered on my instruction sheet. So this, if I remember correctly, this is going to be my satin cover stitch for on the side of the geese, and you'll need a matching bobbin for all these threads. You'll also need decorative stitch thread, and this is what's going to be stitched over the satin stitch. You'll need 2 contrasting threads that contrast with your background fabric, and these are the 2 colors I've chosen, and you'll also need a matching bobbin. And then there's going to be the vine that stitches through there. You can see the vine in the instruction and the feather, and this is my thread for that. To do the block, you'll also need a water-soluble thread, an embroidery bobbin thread, and I'm going to be using black because I'm using black fabric. If you're using a lighter fabric, you'll probably want to use a white bobbin, and then scissors to be able to cut the fabric while it's in the hoop. And then you'll also need a piece of battleizer that will be large enough to fit your hoop. I have mine in here with, we call them hoop huggers or hoop helpers. It's basically shelf liner that's placed inside there, and that helps grip that so nothing moves while it's stitching out. And you kind of need that little extra help with our blocks because they sometimes have got a little more intense embroidery in them, and it's going through all those layers. So let's go to the sewing machine and we'll start with step number 1. Okay, here I am at the machine and we're getting ready to get started. I have my embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and I have a neutral colored thread in the needle. And what we're going to do now is we're just going to stitch out the outline of the pattern right onto the battleizer. Well, here you can see it has stitched an outline of the design, so now we're going to move on to step 2. And if you look at the instructions, it says change the water-soluble thread in the needle and place fabric 2 over this section and sew the tack down, and then we're going to trim it. If you look at the instructions, you can see where that outline is, and we did the instructions like this so that you can see exactly where that stitching is going to go. Some embroidery machines will give you that information and you'll see it right on the screen. Others will not. So for those of you who will not, we tried to give you a visual of where that's going to stitch. So bear with me while I put my water-soluble thread in, and we'll show you exactly how we do step 2. Alright, we have our water-soluble thread in, and this is my fabric 2. And the instructions say to just lay it right over that section, which is this section right here. And we're going to lay it so it goes about a 1/2 inch over the outside edge. And let's stitch that outline over the top using water-soluble thread. Okay, now we're going to trim. So anything inside your block, you're going to trim it 1/4 inch. And that's an approximate thing. Since we do our stitching first and we trim afterwards, it's not as crucial as it is in traditional quilting where you have to make sure you cut exactly perfectly. Anything that's on the outside edge, we're going to leave it at least a 1/2 inch extending beyond there. I'm a little bit short of 1/2 inch, but again, it's just kind of an approximate thing because we are going to trim the block up afterwards. So let's move on to step number 3. Okay, for step 3, we're going to take our water-soluble thread out, and I have put my 3MSS thread in, which is basically a matching thread that matches fabric 3, and it's also the thread we'll use for the satin stitch. And now that that thread's in there, we're going to lay our fabric 3. We're going to lay it right sides down to the fabric 2, and we are going to let the machine sew a seam. Now I'm using a batik here, so it looks like my right side's up, but my right side is down. Make sure my thread doesn't get hung up in there. But it sews a seam. And I have my thread cutter turned off right now. So then you're going to flip your fabric, and this is for step number 4. You are going to finger press, and you're going to let the machine stitch the tack down stitch. And then we're going to trim, so let me bring the hoop forward here so you can see. And for trimming, since this is on the inside of the hoop, you're going to trim a scant 1/4 inch. And now we can move on to step number 5, which is basically taking the same fabric, laying it right sides over fabric 2 over on the other side, and letting it sew a seam. This is step number 5. Again, we're going to flip the fabric. Cut my little thread tails here. You're going to flip your fabric. Bring the right side up. You're going to finger press. And it's going to sew the tack down, and then we'll trim it again. Now, after we do this, we have 1 goose done. We got a couple more to do for this particular block. Step number 7 through 12 will be us making the next goose. And so what you're going to do to begin is you're going to take your fabric 2, lay it right side down over the last section of geese, whatever the proper pronunciation is there, and you're going to let the machine sew the seam. Okay, then what we'll do is we'll flip the fabric, finger press, and we'll repeat the steps that we did earlier for the sky fabric. And so I won't be back to talk to you anymore. Well, you can just watch the machine stitch it out. Okay, we have our fabric 2 on there, and we sewed the seam. I flipped and finger pressed, and it stitched the tack down. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take our fabric 3 for our background or our sky fabric, lay it right over the top of fabric 2, machine sews the seam, and then again we're going to repeat with flipping the fabric, finger pressing it, and letting the machine stitch the tack down. Well, there's my completed flying geese for this particular block. I do want to point out that when I did my tack down stitch for the the pink fabric on there, the background fabric, I did use water soluble thread in there, and that is so that when you sew your blocks together, if the stitching happens to be showing in your seam, you can just get it wet and it'll dissolve. You can do that after you have your block or your quilt completely put together. And you don't need to worry about that because there will be the satin cover stitch is going to be over that, and that is what's going to hold it in place. Now I'm going to take my background fabric. This is my 9-inch square background fabric, and I'm going to lay it right to center, right over that. And if you have to do a little peek underneath, make sure you're lined up good. And it should hang about a ½ inch over on both sides and also on the top and bottom. And what the machine's going to do now is it's going to just sew a tack down stitch to hold that in place, and we are using water soluble thread. And again, for the same reason as I mentioned before, because it's going to stitch around the outline of outside edge of the block, and that way you can just dissolve it once your quilt's put together. Here is my block, and the first thing you're going to do is you're going to trim real close to the stitching here. I've already done that at the bottom. I'm going to turn it this way, and you're going to cut real close to the stitching too. And what's that is going to do is it is going to reveal the flying geese on the inside. And I'm using our hoop scissors, which is an offset handle scissors that has a straight blade and a nice sharp point, and it really helps you get really close to that stitching. Alright, there is my block with my background fabric cut away to reveal the flying geese. The next step is we are going to turn it over, and we're going to take my backing fabric. I've already sprayed it with a temporary spray adhesive, and we're going to center that over the block. So you might need to give a little peek underneath just to make sure you got it centered really well. Be very careful, you don't want to push on that or risk loosening it in the hoop or having the hoop pop out. Just lightly take that and adhere it to the back. And it's like anti-gravity, it's wonderful. And let's take it to the machine, and what we're going to do is we still have our water-soluble thread in the machine. Let me attach this, and what we're going to do is it is going to just stitch an outline of the block, and that's going to hold that backing fabric on. You may want to, before you start stitching, just kind of do a peek underneath. Linda and I like to call that a Dunlop. It's kind of when your fabric Dunlops over and you stitch it on there wrong. It's kind of a goofy term, but we like to use that, so you're going to want to make sure you don't have a Dunlop. And I probably have a sample somewhere here of showing the Dunlop. But it's just about finished with its outline. Now at this point you probably want to make sure that if your machine has a thread cutting feature, you'll probably want to make sure that you turn that automatic thread cutting feature off, because sometimes what the machines will do is it might leave a little bird's nest or a little thread tail in there that isn't all that pretty. So what you might want to try is turning it off, and from here on out you'll see I have another little tip for you as far as getting started with your embroidery thread that helps keep your back look just as neat and pretty as your front. Okay, for step number 21, I have my thread cutter turned off, and it says to place fabric 1CA, which is one matching fabric that is contrasting to fabric number 1, and now I have written that here, 1CA, and for me it was thread 1921. That thread is in the needle and in the bobbin because we have our backing fabric on. So once you have your backing fabric on, you're going to want to match your needle thread to your bobbin thread. And another little tip I want to show you for a nice, neat, clean back is that when you begin with a new thread, if you just do needle down and needle up and bring your bobbin thread to the top, and then you can begin stitching, it makes the back look much neater. So we'll let it stitch the design for step number 21. For step number 22, you're going to take your contrasting thread B and you're going to put that in both the needle and the bobbin and let it stitch out the embroidery design. Don't forget to do your needle down, your needle up to bring that bobbin thread to the top. You'll thank me later. Almost done. Step 23 out of 25. The next thing we're going to do is place our V fabric, which is our vine fabric, in the needle and the bobbin, and we're going to let it sew out the feathers and the vines. Forget to do needle down, needle up, so you don't have ugliness on the back of your block. Well, there's my satin stitch, and the very last step in this particular block is to put your decorative stitch thread in the bobbin and the needle and sew the decorative stitch over the top of the satin stitch. Well, here is our completed block A3, and you can see the beautiful decorative stitch that sews on top of the satin stitch really makes it look nice. And basically our block A3 is finished, and what you'll need to do now is you'll need to decide whether this block is going to, your quilt is going to have a border block attached to the side of it, since this is the left edge of the quilt, or if you're going to just not do the border blocks, in which case you're going to put a binding on here. If you're not doing border blocks and you're just going to put a binding on the edge, you need to trim that left edge 1/4 of an inch away from the stitching here. So you would take your ruler and you would line your ruler up. Can you see that? Right here, line it up, that stitching, with the 1/4 inch mark on your ruler, and you would cut through all the layers. Then the other 3 sides you would trim using the trimmer by George. So let me show you how to do the trimmer by George. Anytime you have a block that is going to be joined, joining another block, you're going to use the trimmer by George to join the blocks visibly. So what you'll do is you'll take your fabric on the top and you will just finger press it, or you could take it to the iron if you wanted to. Just that top layer of fabric, or layers if there's piecing on one side. And this is the trimmer by George, and it has the crimped edge. You're going to take that crimped edge and you're going to snug it right up to that line of stitching, and then you're going to lay it down. You're going to give a little tug to make sure that it is close to the stitching as you can possibly get it, and then you're going to use your rotary cutter to trim off the batting and the backing fabric. And then what you have then is your front background fabric is still on there, but see how close it's trimmed up to the stitching there. So any side of a block that you have that will be joining another block, you'll trim using the trimmer by George. Once you get the backing fabric and your battleizer gone, you're then going to take your ruler and you're going to trim it 1/4 of an inch away from this stitching. So here's my stitching. There's my 1/4 inch mark on my ruler. I will slide it right over the top of it. I'll use my rotary cutter to cut it away. So that's the front of the block, and there's the back of the block just on the one side using the trimmer by George. This is the front of my block all trimmed up, and here's the back of my block trimmed up using the trimmer by George on all 4 sides. And this is how you would trim it if you're going to be adding a border block on the outside of it.